Welcome to the Lifestyle Evolution Podcast. I am your host, Joshua Laycock. I am not my past. My past does not define me. I hear this from so many clients that it's almost like a bit of a broken record. And I understand completely the sentiment behind it, the intention behind it to be forward looking. But unfortunately, in a very literal sense, it's just not true. We are in this very moment the precise, unique conflagration of all the things that have happened to us in our lifetime, even before we were born, even while we were in utero, being carried by our mothers. That is why there are no identical human beings. Even identical twins grow up to be different human beings because we are the concentration. We are the perfect mix of what life has thrown at us. And it is probably one of the single largest barriers to helping men and people heal and move through their current states, which, if you're speaking to me in a therapeutic capacity, are probably holding you back from enjoying life, from functioning, forming relationships. And if you're a coaching client, you've probably bashed into them hard enough now that they've moved a little bit, but it is something that is likely holding you back from excelling and taking off and achieving all of your dreams. For a lot of people, I think there's this fear of accepting a reality as an excuse. And that's where I think when I say I understand the intention, because it's true, it is easy to look back, to inventory the life that we've lived and the things that have happened to us, and to say, well, then that's why I am the way I am. And I do believe that, you know, I'd like to avoid being political, but I do see a significant rise in victimhood, and that understanding why something is the way it is this path to pure acceptance and, in a way, surrender. And I think that a lot of men are rightly turned off by victimhood. But I think we throw out the baby with the bathwater when we deny exploration of the things that do influence who we are, that do shape the way that we show up, and not just sort of how our character is formed, but I'm talking about physiological wiring and physiological responses to our environment and to stimulus that in the very short term we have very little control over. And that developing those controls, that understanding, and doing the work necessary to overcome these challenges, well, it's scary. And for some people, I think facing those realities may also now confront you with the reality that this is going to take work. This is going to be difficult. And there is a risk that if you don't address these things you may fail. And ironically, a lot of the challenges and programming that may have found its way into your body reinforce the risk and threat of challenge and failure. So I jumped into this, but what am I talking about? I say this with a lot of my clients, coaching therapy. And if some of you are listening, you'll probably chuckle because I probably said it to you 100 times. I do believe that for every human being, everything in this exact moment is as it should be, given the life that you have lived in and the relationships that you have and the experiences that have happened to you. That's not to say that this is a good thing. That's not to say that, we should just take life and be like, well, that's what it is. No. But all the way from in utero, the stress and anxiety and the challenges that your mother was facing through the nature of your birth, through your very early sort of first 18-month, extremely formative years, to as you grow and ideally mature, we are taking inputs in from the people around us who matter constantly. And particularly as young babies, we are hyper, hyper sensitive and aware of the mental states and the stress and the anxiety that the people around us feel. And we need to be interacted with in a way that makes us feel safe and makes us feel secure and makes us feel valued and allows us, ideally, to belong with a community while also being who we are authentically, right? By not having to put on too much of a false persona to quote unquote fit in. That's the difference between fitting in and belonging. Belonging is your true self is accepted within the community, within your group of peers. Fitting in is changing who you are so that you're not abandoned and thrown out. And while it might feel like the ends justify the means, there is a shocking difference between allowing yourself to show up and to belong versus adapting who you are, putting on a show so that you're not rejected from the group. And as things happen to us, this is not a deep, deep dive into trauma, but I want to give a glimmer to people, particularly to those who are skeptical, particularly to those who may want nothing to do with their past and just want to plow forward. Well, that past has taught us how to operate in certain circumstances. You may not have big T trauma, you may have a lot of little t trauma, or you may simply have had what would appear to be a fairly idyllic life, but we are still impacted by those things. And I'll give a personal example that I've shared before, and I'm using this example to reiterate that this doesn't have to be a witch hunt. This doesn't have to be about blaming or vilifying the people who raised us. So I have a very, very close relationship with my biological father, my dad, but I was principally raised by my mom and my stepfather. It's where I spent my weeks, my days. And they had a marvelous marriage. My stepfather passed away a long time ago. They had a great relationship. It wasn't perfect, but growing up, I saw lots of love and affection and kindness, and he treated her well, and she showed him respect, and it was wonderful. And they never disagreed or argued or fought in front of me. And I know now, talking to my mom, of course, they had their challenges and their disputes, just like any relationship does. But it was never done in front of me. And that's great. Sounds wonderful. Except when I got married and was in a relationship, if we would have a disagreement or a dispute, or we would have even just a tough conversation to have, I would freak out and run. Not physically, but I'd shut down. I'd withdraw, like so many guys do. I've done a whole episode on it. Why? Because I never experienced what healthy conflict looks like. So in my mind, a successful marriage, a successful relationship had an absence of conflict. So when I was faced with conflict, I was then faced with, in my mind, the very real threat that my relationship could be over, that this clearly couldn't be a high quality relationship, because why would I have conflict then? And of course, that's not true. And we learned how to communicate, and we have a thriving marriage. But I give that example because not everything is about abuse. Not everything is about screaming and yelling and hostility and violence. And while those things certainly exist, and unfortunately, and it breaks my heart, they exist on a scale that I think a lot of people, if you didn't experience that, may not appreciate. But this isn't about a witch hunt. Understanding and awareness of our path is greater than finding excuses. I think what trips a lot of people up is that if I break my arm and I go into the hospital and I go, my arm is broken and it's flopping around. If they were to sit there and be like, well, how'd you break it? Well, I fell off my bike. Why'd you feel like riding your bike today? Well, not really relevant, but I just felt like going for a ride. I felt like some exhilaration. What, why? Why? Something wrong? Did you feel like, you needed to move fast and to have like, if they started to probe what led to the arm being broken, meanwhile it's flopping around, you're rightly going to be like, maybe we deal with that later. Why don't you set the bone, get the pain to go away, and then we'll deal with maybe some of the silly things that I did later. And that makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, when it comes to matters of the heart, matters of the mind, matters of the soul, a little less tangible and touchy, it doesn't work that way. We can't simply set the bone and make the pain go away. Now, there are tools and tactics that can be used to help ameliorate the situation in the moment. CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, I think is very effective at that. It's like I've often called it, it's like therapeutic triage. But I'll be honest, I'm not entirely convinced it goes deep enough. I think that it's the equivalent of maybe stopping the bleeding. It's maybe the equivalent of cleaning up the mess, or maybe how to navigate without making it worse. But I don't think that it goes deep enough. And I don't think that it allows for as massively a fulsome exploration of what we need. And look, there's going to be people that disagree with me, and that's okay. What I hear often from people who come to me to address an issue is they don't understand why they're showing up the way that they're showing up, right? So what are some situations? They don't understand that why maybe they have a disagreement with their spouse, they get super defensive, or they shut down, or they get angry, and they have these like outbursts. They don't understand why seemingly small events trigger this panic in them and why it seems like their brains just shut off and turn to mush. I had a client a long time ago say to me, like, when life happens to me, I turn into an idiot. It was actually a very astute observation. When life happens to me, I turn into an idiot. Probably feels that way. Or, not just why am I like this, but I hate this part of me. And the biggest challenge is that healing and growth happens through compassion and love and grace, not in brute force, not in anger, not in hate. Augmenting, improving, healing, whatever label you want to put on it. It's not like a nail that we drive into a piece of lumber. It's not like the harder you hit it, the faster it goes, the deeper it goes. No. Often the things that show up in our lives today, which we might call dysfunctional or whatever, are a result of something that happened to us when we were a child. And our bodies have created this defense mechanism to protect us from something that we experienced as a child. And it is a wonderful part of what our body is capable of. It protects us from things that when we were 8, not only should we not have to deal with, but we were often incapable of dealing with, whether that's disassociating, shutting down, right? Whether that's learning to not have an opinion, learning to keep quiet, learning to try to keep everyone happy, learning to be hyper vigilant of what kind of a mood or state mom or dad were in, right? Maybe it taught us how to dress a certain way, even though I didn't really feel like dressing that way, but it avoided me being bullied. Maybe I learned to be a bully because then I didn't get bullied. Or maybe I learned that I could bully someone else because, you know what, I got bullied at home. So it allowed me to sort of balance the scales on not feeling shitty about myself. Right? Maybe I didn't have a caregiver who was reliable. So I don't have a lot of trust in people. Maybe I had a caregiver who scared the hell out of me about the world and told me all these horror stories about what's going on out there by them. Therefore, I became clingy and I felt safe only when I was in the warm embrace of mom or dad. And now I walk through life terrified. Maybe it was something as innocent as my parents tried their very best to shield me from things of the world like conflict and yelling and heartache. And while that may have been noble, now that life is happening to me, you know, I'm not equipped to handle these things. Maybe failure feels so scary because you weren't allowed to fail. Maybe they tried to prepare the road for the child as opposed to the child for the road, as is often said. It's not always about malice. And we forget, right? We think our parents, particularly when we're younger, are superhuman. I think it's good that we see them that way in many cases. I overheard my son the other day telling one of his friends that I was built like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Okay, I got a little bit of muscle, but it's an interesting reminder about how they see us. He probably doesn't see the challenges that I'm facing and that I work through, although we're making a very conscious effort, particularly as he gets older, to share that honest evaluation of what the world can look like. And I certainly can tell you that growing up, I didn't have a huge appreciation of what my mom and my dad and my stepdad went through and the burdens that they carried and their parents before them and so on and so forth. We don't have that capacity as a small child to see it that way. Whatever mom or dad brings to the table, I think as a young child, we see that as what is supposed to be, what is supposed to happen. If mom or dad drinks, well, then drinking is normalized. If mom and dad yell, then yelling is normalized. If mom and dad are never around, well, then that's normalized. In our young minds, that's the way it should be. And our brains develop expecting those things. And if those things are painful, then our brains develop to protect us from those things. And the challenge is that these hyper alert young children within us as we grow, if we haven't addressed those issues, if we haven't explored them and accepted them and honored them and moved through them, we haven't stopped resisting them or ignoring them, then these hypervigilant systems don't know how to turn off. The smallest things in our adult life trigger us, alert us to these perceived threats and dangers, and then overcompensates because we haven't given permission for the 8-year-old version of us to stand down and to relax and to let us as adults take it now. We don't set that part of us on the shelf with hatred or anger. And why should we? Every part of us has served us in some way, I believe. But what we needed when we were 8 or 14 or 20 or 36 or 45 changes. But if we're not aware of what we bring to the table and how things influence us, and through exploration and kindness and grace, allow those things to stand down, they are the faithful soldiers who continue to march with us day in and day out, constantly at the ready. And it is draining. And in many ways, it gets in the way of what we're trying to accomplish. Relationships, I find, are the bellwether of our own mental health. I think that if we have healthy, happy, authentic, genuine relationships where we get a sense of belonging and safety, then I think we're probably doing pretty well. And as our world becomes more fragmented and the sense of community, particularly here in the West, is eroding, we have more eggs in fewer baskets, right? We have fewer relationships. So not only are we not able to rely on as many people as we used to, we have this really precarious situation that if one or two relationships falter, then we are what feels like very much alone. Adds to the fear, right? Adds to that hypervigilance. That's why you get into avoidant and insecure attachment types. That's why we cling so hard to things that are not in our best interest, because often we have very few opportunities to explore. That's not true. We don't have opportunities. We have limitless opportunities. We've created an environment where we don't prioritize having as many opportunities to cultivate strong and diverse relationships. The interesting thing about relationships is that they are the symptoms of things that are not working well. But then also, as they erode, they become the cause of so much of our own suffering. But we avoid going back and we avoid doing the work. It's like trying to get fit without breaking a sweat or lifting weights. It just doesn't really work. You know, we have so much opportunity to heal, sure, with a therapist, but even just through our own exploration, through our own understanding and openness to why things are the way they are. I quote Dewey Freeman a lot. One of the things that he said in a session with a bunch of men, and I've used it, is that, and I'll paraphrase it because I won't get it perfectly right because I've tweaked it so many times, but essentially he says, there's no abnormal behavior. There is only normal behavior in response to abnormal situations. In other words, you are not broken. You are not flawed. You are merely, but remarkably, the byproduct of everything that has happened in your life until this very moment. Every interaction, every crosswind, every tailwind, every challenge, every stumble, every time someone picks you up, every time someone gives you a compliment, every time someone tears you down, every time you're unsure of what the world is going to bring, every time you walk through it with your shoulders back, prepared to take on a challenge, those things influence you in ways that I don't even think that we can begin to comprehend. And as I said, it's not always about vilifying. Sometimes forgiveness is a very helpful tool, but forgiveness comes from love. It's not about ratifying what happened, but it's about saying, I'm not going to carry this anymore. I am not my past. My past does not define me. In this exact moment, I would disagree respectfully because those things matter. And to deny that that life that we've lived matters, well, aside from not being accurate, it's sad because while we do a really good job of inventorying the things that we don't like, it's easy to forget about all the really incredible good things that have happened to you that have also helped create who you are. And while many of us walk in pain and struggle to connect and often feel alone, we also tend to undervalue the goodness that is already within us. There are a lot of good things within us that get overshadowed by the dark. So while in this exact moment, I am a byproduct of my past, the freedom and the potency lies in the fact that I get to make choices in this exact moment. I get to choose what I do next. Yes, there are times when my past will override and drive me down a road that I may not want to go, but with awareness, we can recognize when that is happening and we can come back into the moment and we can take steps. We could find a therapist. We could work with a coach. We can cultivate our relationships. We can journal. We can choose to start to get healthy. We can choose to be mindful of what we eat. We can choose to be mindful of what kind of media we consume. We can choose what kind of books we read. We can make those decisions because every single little decision that we make instantly becomes our past. The beginning of this podcast is now my past. And just like all of those things that may have happened to me as a child and that I may have experienced as I grow, that also gets woven into the tapestry of my life. And as we begin to replace the old with the newer, with the more constructive and the more compassionate and the more productive, then we get to start to slowly write ourselves a new past. So while we are our past, and our past does define us, the difference between those who settle into victimhood versus those who use that understanding and awareness as a catalyst for potent change is the willingness to begin immediately to rewrite your past and to add to it in a constructive way that helps you grow and helps you become a better man step by step by step. But just like it took you an entire lifetime to get to where you are, those patterns are not going to change overnight. Mere awareness of your past isn't enough. It's doing the cathartic work of releasing what you're carrying, understanding how it shows up in your world, having the tools to recognize when it continues to show up, and learning how to see it with grace and kindness, and working gently to allow it to stand down, to strip away those painful things that have influenced us, and to allow the beautiful things to flourish. So if you're on this path and you're reluctant to explore the past, if you're reluctant to let in the influences of what has happened since before you were born, all the way until this very moment, this last word that I say, know that that is the path that you have to walk if you want to minimize the burden of those things. Denying it does nothing other than fuel it. It is a gentle balance between looking back, looking inward, and looking forward. But you require all of those elements, looking back, looking inward, looking forward. And to deny any of those elements, to over-index one over the other, I think leads to dysfunction, leads to unhappiness, leads to conflict within yourself, interpersonally. If you're someone who only lives in the past, good or bad, you're not moving forward, you're stale, you're stagnant. If you live introspectively exclusively, well, again, it's not a horrible place to be, but generally, outward relationships, outward joys, they don't exist when we're looking inward exclusively. And it's hard to plan, and it's hard to thrive, and it's hard to have a purpose when that's all that we do. But also, if we blindly throw the past behind us and we only look forward, onward only, well, then we deny and we ignore all of the influences that continue to drag us and pull us in different directions. In my discussion on vision, I talk about gravity. Our history has a gravity. It influences our path, just like sort of celestial gravity influences the path of planets. We can't deny it. We have to understand it. At the very least, so that it can become almost predictable, but ideally so that we can move through it and then hopefully one day lessen the potency of that past as we overwrite it with something more in line with who we are and who we want to be. So I'll leave you there. If you find yourself stomping your foot and saying, I am not my past does not define me, to hell with that. Take a breath, reach out to a guide, and find the courage to explore those parts of you because they tell your story, not exclusively, but it's a really important part. It's like jumping into a book halfway through with no backstory. It just doesn't work. You might get bits and pieces here and there, but you're not really going to understand the color, the nuance. So find a guide, embrace the past, learn from it, accept it as part of who you are, and then recognize that in every moment, you get to rewrite that past by making sound, caring, compassionate decisions. And in time, this new past will continue to define you. And with some skill, and with some luck, and with some patience, with a whole lot of courage, that new past will begin to lead you to a place that you want to go. Shoot me a message if you have any questions. If you have a difficult past, please do that exploration with a trained professional. Be very, very mindful of drugs and psychedelics. There's a lot of talk right now about how wonderful they are therapeutically, and I tend to peripherally agree. I say it because I'm not an expert, but I also know that it can blow the doors open to a world that you may not have been ready to confront. And if you're doing that by yourself, I think that can be very dangerous and challenging. We'll do a whole different episode on psychedelics and their use in therapy and in personal development. But explore your past, but find a guide, a trained, skilled guide who can be there with you, and don't be in a rush and approach it with love. Have a fantastic day. We'll talk to you soon.